Hi, my name is Christina, and you are watching another episode of Caucasus Talks. As a quick reminder, this is a platform that brings together young professionals from the South Caucasus to discuss issues that are common in the region. And we believe that through exchange of knowledge, we can start to think about common solutions to those problems. Today, I will be talking with Nargiz Mukhtarova, a researcher and an activist interested in women's issues and femicide, which is the topic of our discussion today, femicide in Azerbaijan. This is, of course, a terrifying issue that is common in the region. But before diving into the details of this issue, which is very multi-layered and contains cultural aspects to it, poor policy making, and many other problems that we will touch upon during our discussion. But first, Nargiz, thank you for joining me today. And the first question I want to ask you is just to introduce yourself in general in terms of your research interests and why do we discuss this topic today with you?
Thank you for your invitation, Christina. As a woman, I think firstly I have interest in this topic because there are many specific problems in women's rights, but some of them is invisible in our region, I don't know, in our country, and therefore I chose some specific problems to focus on them. Femicide is one of them. Because in our country, even most of people do not what it means. And therefore, I think if I begin advocacy campaign as an activist, as a woman, it helps us to raise awareness about femicide in my country. Therefore, I begin actually it's not started yet, but I'm planning to have a website on femicide.
Yes, and I was going to ask you about it, to tell a bit more in details. What is the goal of creating this website and what do you plan to have there?
My project aims to as I said, raise awareness about femicide and draw the necessary attention to this issue in Azerbaijan. The ultimate goal of my project is to have an informative section in my website on femicide and their causes. And also, I will try to provide free legal aid to the victims of violence. I think there is a need in Azerbaijan, such a platform. In my country, we cannot say that how the tendency is on femicide because we do not have enough data. There are a few reports only, and it contains information which are collected by the media monitoring. And I think if we need to solve the problem, or at least to reduce the number of the cases, we need more visibility. And this website will help us to provide it. It will cover the information by collected daily basis, and also we will have a blog post part, it will be open for everyone who wants to write their own story, and also on gender issues and femicide and other related topics. And also, it does not only consist of statistics. We will divide the cases into different groups, they will be divided for the type of femicides, the reasons of behind it, because we know there are different reasons for this type of killing of women, and I guess it will be helpful to identify the problems and help to focus on a more specific problem. And the other important part of my website will be our helpline and online chat. We already agreed on some volunteer lawyer groups, and the helpline will give a chance to the victims of violence to get direct access to the lawyer groups. It makes easy to have legal aid for the victims. In our country, the most victims depend on their perpetrator economically, and therefore it's not easy to find a legal consultation or lawyer to them. Therefore, I think it can be helpful to in the beginning to have access to the legal aid, and it may be like it makes situation easy for the victims to escape where they face the violation and to get directly help from the professional lawyers, and that's all I think.
Yeah, of course, good luck with your project. One of the questions about that now I have about it in my mind is do women speak up about this? And having the Armenian context in mind, I guess it's the same also in Azerbaijan. Do women really reach out even when you have a hotline and when you just present the possibilities of support they can get, legal, social, and psychological? Do they really reach out? And what is the culture in these terms? What are the problems on this side?
Actually, yes, you're right. They don't reach actually, but I think there is some reasons. It's one of them. Yes, it's cultural reason, and the reach hotline or helpline, like it's an ultimate action of the victims. But I think it depends on situation, because in our country there is only one helpline, if I'm not mistaken, and it's provided by the state. And I think there is it can be not like work because of their reaction of the victims, because like the victims want to apply the police or to the states, but they do not see the necessary reaction from them, and therefore they just don't believe them. And I think if we can provide a bit more how can I say, more believable or more open platform for the victims, maybe they can trust us, and maybe they can apply, and we can encourage them to apply.
I believe there is another layer to the issue why women don't reach out. And you tell me if that's the case in Azerbaijan too, but there's also an issue of victim blaming, basically. And
Yes.
I think you also mentioned that women actually reach out, but they don't really get the response they have to get. What is the
Yes.
situation in this regards? What are the discourses about this among different groups in the society, and what is the attitude towards women that are victims of violence?
The victim blaming, like unfortunately, is widespread in the country. And people are more likely to see the victim as weak, helpless, and vulnerable. Then they may condemn the perpetrators. But otherwise, if the opposite happens, then the people think that they deserve the violence. People want to believe that she did something wrong, she annoyed the man, or she committed some misconduct, and these are the kinds of weird excuses for the killings of women. About a month ago, a transgender woman was killed in our country, and I saw the reactions. People almost honor the killer, because the victim is a trans woman and is a sex worker. Both are unacceptable for Azerbaijan. In such cases, people's anger increases. Like, I saw only one news about this incident in the media, and in this article, the killer was presented as a victim, and they tried to show that he was simply defending himself. And it's known that stabbing a person 8 times it cannot be considered self-defense, and it's a murder on purpose. But the news presented in this type of femicide cases has a negative effect on the people as well. I think therefore we need to change the media language to affect the people's attitudes and to raise the awareness on these cases. And also there is how can I say, normalizations of, they try to normalize the relations between victim and perpetrator. It's doing by the society, by the law enforcement officials, and they try to restore the family ties. And this is also problematic among the different groups, because like firstly, the restoration of family ties frees the perpetrator of any punishment, and also it puts the survivor at risk of being repeatedly subjected to violence. And I think also that there is a problematic issue that we focus on awareness raising campaigns, but then we ignore the other structural problems. If we try to say like the main thing is awareness raising on femicide, and we deny the male supremacy in our country and the sexist policy of the government, and also there is an approach from the different groups that they try to show that the women themselves do not their rights, therefore they don't demand them. And this approach also is problematic, like it individualizes the responsibility for the violence and attributes it to the victims themselves and their ignorance. And also, it also renders invisible the structural conditions that make such violent behavior possible. That's all. I think victim blaming and such individualizations of the women's, like they try to put the blame on the woman.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. And recently I was reading a report that was that also included statistics on women's perception of domestic violence, and yeah, it was vividly showing how it's normalized among women. For example, there were questions. So basically the question was when domestic violence can be justified, and women were mentioning poorly cooked meal, arguing with your husband, and several other this kind of questions. So basically these were the contexts in which situations in which women consider it's justifiable to be beaten up by their partners. You mentioned the state and policy making several times actually, so I want to ask you to elaborate more on that. What is the role of the state and policy making in this in this context regarding these issues, and what can be done basically? What do you think, what can be improved? What is the situation and what can be improved?
The situation is getting worse, I think, because there is some law and policy was accepted by the government. For example, National Action Plan is recently, I think, begin to implement. But I think the results and the change are not visible. We do not notice it, that there is a positive change. I think law and policy should provide the foundation for a coordinated and comprehensive approach to violence against women. And there is a need to change, firstly, in the legislation, because in our country, I think the impunity prevails on these issues. The police and law enforcement officials do not respond adequately. And it also discouraged women and victims from contacting them. There are already, as already we mentioned, that reasons to discourage women to apply the police or to reach the helps, but one of the main reasons of the reactions of the police and of the officials, like the police usually acts like a peacemaker in our country, like complaints are often ignored or tried to reconcile. Like in many cases, this can result in the death of the victim. We have an article in our law on domestic violence against women. Like there is an article which gives a chance to the police that they can try to reconcile the victims and perpetrators. And therefore, I think in such cases when result the death of the victim, the police or law enforcement officials who incited her to reconcile are not prosecuted, because it's totally legal. There is an article, and they saw it's kind of their duty. And in last year, only 11 women applied for protection orders in our country. And it's a bit like strange if we take into account that more than 80% women face violence. For the official numbers, it completely see that the women do not trust on the officials. And also, like as a change, I would like to see the reforms. The firstly is the legislation should change. The article allowing the police to take a conciliatory position must be changed. Like as an adult, I complain to the police, and why should they act in a such a way that you have to think again and you cannot decide like right decision about your life? They are police, and their duty should be to protect the citizens, not give advice to them. And I think, therefore, changes in the legislation should begin, and then the law enforcement agency involved in the whole process should be trained, learn the rules of the of treatment of victims, so that the victims come out of this process with the less harm, because we know that mostly they face the violence by their partners or someone stranger, but they face twice such kind of violence by the officials as well. And therefore, I think we need firstly to change the legislation and to train all officials who face who works with the victims of violence.
Yeah, that's true. And yeah, I listen to what you say, and I just absolutely relate to it, having the Armenian context in mind. And I think there is another similarity that I found is this controversy and the issue with the Istanbul Convention. And just to remind, it's a convention on preventing and combating violence against women and domestic violence. So if I'm not mistaken, Azerbaijan passed it in 2011, but never ratified it.
Azerbaijan has not signed it yet. I think only two countries, Russia and Azerbaijan, has not signed it yet. And for the Istanbul Convention discussion, I think have been going on since 2015. But there are still no results. They have previously argued that we need to bring laws into line with the convention, and that it takes time and money, and they claim that there is not enough funding to increase the number of shelters and so on. But it seems that there is no political will to implement all this. Because if the convention is signed and ratified, they will have more obligations to protect the women's rights. And I don't know after certifying how long these obligations will be fulfilled, but so far I think it seems that at the initial stage they are not very enthusiastic to sign and to ratify it. Even we had a rally in last year in October. A group of activists were held because in October, only in first week, 12 women were killed in Azerbaijan, and they protest the silence of the government, and they demand that to sign and ratify Istanbul Convention. But there is no answer from the government side still.
I see. Yeah, you mentioned rallies. So I want to ask you, and you also mentioned that you are an activist. So my question is, what is the role of civil society in all this?
Because there are many young activists. For example, before we never had such rallies. We in recent 2 years we had 8 March rallies, and we had one of them for these femicide cases, and I think all of them is positive change, but there are many problems here as well. According to the NGO laws in Azerbaijan, the activities of these organizations are severely restricted. And therefore this directly affects their usefulness. We have strict limitations on grant law. Therefore, only pro-governmental organizations can work easily. And therefore, some volunteer initiatives maybe help the victims, like they try to provide free psychological assistance services, legal services. They're quite helpful in such matters, but the impact is not noticeable due to small number and limited activities. And I think therefore also there are also need to change the legislation on NGO and on grant law, because if they cannot work and how can I say, there is I'm sorry, this they cannot get grant, and therefore they try just not to work in Azerbaijan, and therefore they cannot be helpful for the victims. Only small groups try to initiate some campaigns for the victims, and it's really small steps, just and therefore it's not noticeable.
I see. So there are smaller initiatives, not institutionalized, basically not formed into NGOs. Are those activist groups, and what are their actions? What do they do, and how do they support these women?
Yes, they are activist groups. They mostly try to find shelters, and sometimes they help them to escape where the victims are, and they try to find legal aid, psychological assistance for the victims, and also they begin some advocacy campaign to push the government to sign for example, Istanbul Convention, or to change the laws on domestic violence, and they have such activities. But I think, for example, in October, we only had 50 people in the rally, and I think it's not how can I say, a big group for the 10 million population country, and therefore they just try to do something, but it's not enough. It's not enough for a big country. Even 50 people, they cannot make big changes. We need more people to involve our group.
I see. So activists do their best, but there is need for systemic changes. Yeah. Well, probably the last question I want to ask is, do you think, or what is your opinion on the regional possible cooperation on this matter? Can the awareness among Azerbaijani women that the issue is common in the region, or vice versa, somehow help the situation? Or yeah, what are your thoughts about this?
I think we need a coordination because, like, we are culturally similar countries, and if we try to learn something from Europe, it's completely different. They're like we need to learn our experience among our regions. For example, I don't know, like. In Europe, the process is going completely differently, and now their problems, their solutions ways is totally different from us, and therefore I think to change the experience between our activists in the region, it will be quite helpful, because I think maybe their experience, their practices is in the better than us, and we need something to learn from them, and there's therefore I think yes, it can be helpful if we have like coordination between the activists and NGOs in the regions.
Thank you very much, Nargis, for this conversation. And yeah, I want to remind you, you were watching another episode of Caucasus Talks. Follow us, and also why not suggest new topics for new discussions on our platform. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.